This is your video for completing the molecular modeling lab, which is lab 7 in your lab manual. And you've been provided with a couple of bags of molecular model kits to help you complete this activity. Normally we would be doing this in the laboratory and you would have a lab kit at your bench and we would complete this all together. So we've provided you with a lab kit to use at home. But I wanted to talk a little bit about the various parts of your lab kit and how they're supposed to be used. Okay, so you have various different colored balls in your lab kit, and they represent different classes of elements. But there are some that are almost always the same color for the same element. The first, the black ones, are the carbons. Okay, the red ones are always oxygens. Blue or purple are almost always nitrogens. The white ones are always hydrogens. Okay, and depending on how many of the small single hold balls you have in the lab kit, you might want to make use of some of the larger multi-hold balls in the lab kit to do hydrogens with, depending on how many you need for your molecule. And then the green ones are always halogens. Right, so halogens, just to remember that class, that's like fluorine, chlorine, bromine, etc. Right, now the types of connectors that you should have two kinds. All right, one is sort of shorter and thicker, and the other one's longer and skinnier. The short, thick ones are for single bonds. Okay, anytime you need to make a single bond, you should use one of these short, thick connectors. Okay, the long, skinny ones are used for making multiple bonds. Okay, in other words, double or triple bonds. Okay, and we do that, and I've got a picture here a little bit further down, because those long, skinny ones are meant to bend sort of around the corners to fit into the holes. And lastly, you've got these funny sort of peach-colored paddle things. These are used to show lone pairs. Okay, so each paddle is one lone pair. Right? So you've got the pieces. You can start to think about how certain elements are supposed to be going together. All right, so let's take a look at a couple of examples of some of the models. Okay, so here we've got a carbon so this is a carbon, this is an oxygen. We have a short, thick stick connector, so we've got a single bond here connected to a hydrogen. Okay, and we've got the skinny sticks, the skinny connectors, making a double bond. Okay, notice that there are two of those on opposite sides. Right, and then we're connected to an oxygen and we're showing lone pairs. Right, so if I were to draw the Lewis drawing for this, I might draw something that looks like this. Okay, so now showing the multiple bonds. Okay, so you can see clearly in this picture how those long, thin connectors are meant to sort of bend around the corners and make a double bond here in the top picture and a triple bond in the lower picture. Okay, so when making your models, you should not be using the skinny connectors to make single bonds because they're kind of bendy and twisty. So if you're using the single bonds, using the skinny connectors to make single bonds, your structures are not going to have the correct shapes. right? Because they're going to kind of be wobbly. When you need single bonds, you should be using the more sturdy, thicker connectors. Okay? So let's talk about the activity itself. All right, so when this activity was created, it was meant to be done with wooden ball and stick models. Okay, and those particular models had 4 holes in the black balls for carbons. It had 2 holes in the red marbles for oxygens. The green halogen balls would have a single hole. Okay, so this first question here is sort of based on that concept. So since you don't have that wooden ball and stick version in front of you, I'm going to go ahead and give you these answers. Lucky you. So carbon normally does form 4 bonds. Oxygen normally forms 2. And chlorine, halogens almost always form single bonds. You will very rarely find a fluorine, a bromine, a hydrogen, or a chlorine forming multiple bonds. Now, whenever this activity is asking for an electron dot diagram, what it's really asking for is a Lewis drawing or a Lewis structure. Okay, so electron dot diagram equals Lewis structure in this activity. Now, this question about is the molecule polar or nonpolar? Generally, you can tell if something's polar or not because a polar molecule will be unsymmetrical. Okay, a nonpolar will be symmetrical. All right, and this depends on structure. So for example, if I look at a strict drawing of water, if I don't take into account the actual geometry, I might say that's a symmetrical molecule, it's nonpolar. But we know from our knowledge of geometry that water is actually a bent molecule, so is polar. Okay, so you need to base this polar-nonpolar judgment on the geometry. Okay, pay attention to the physical geometry. And part of the reason that we're asking you to make these models is so that you can start to see in 3 dimensions what the geometries look like. Okay, so question 5, when making the models, when do you use a stick and when do you use springs? So when it's talking about springs, we're talking about the thin connectors. Okay, because with the wooden ball and stick model kits, there would have been actual springs with connectors on each end of the spring to do the same job of these thin plastic connectors. Okay. Now the bulk of this activity is made up of these tables. Okay, and what you're expected to do, let's use the H2 molecule as an example. You're going to fill in all of the relevant information. So you're going to say there are 2 valence electrons, 1 from each hydrogen. You'll do the electron dot diagram. That's where we're looking for a Lewis structure. Where you're doing ball and stick model, we want you to actually draw a rudimentary picture of what your model looks like. So I would draw a ball with a hydrogen. I would draw the stick, and I'll draw the other hydrogen. Okay, and then we decide whether it's polar or nonpolar. In this case, it is nonpolar. Okay, you'll notice that some of the molecular shapes have dashes, right? And where there's a dash, you are not expected to try and determine a molecular shape. Okay, these first 3 are all simple diatomic molecules, so they don't actually have any meaningful shape. They're just 2 atoms stuck together, so there's no choice but linear. All right, but whenever you see a dash, you are not expected to come up with any kind of molecular shape. Now let's talk about a few of these molecules here. Let's start with F. Okay, and I'm going to go through a few of these because their formulas are not terribly obvious. So with F, you want to connect everything to the carbon atom. Right? With G, hydrogens cannot have more than one connection. So you want to connect both of the oxygens together and put the hydrogens on the outsides. Same thing for I. You'll do the same thing for I as you will for G. Okay, hydrogen cannot handle more than one bond. So you're going to connect the two nitrogens and put the hydrogens on the outsides of each of the nitrogens. Okay, when in doubt, err on the side of making something symmetrical. Right now, with NH2OH, you want to connect the two hydrogens and this oxygen to the nitrogen. Okay, this last hydrogen is going to be connected to the oxygen. Right, looking at L, right, is the same situation as the H2O2. Hydrogen can only form one bond, so you're going to connect the two carbons together and put the hydrogens on the outside. Now coming down to N, this HONO, okay, this type of formula shows you exactly how this should be connected. Hydrogen connected to oxygen, connected to nitrogen, connected to an oxygen. Okay, so build that model in the exact order that the formula shows. For CH2O, you want to connect everything to the carbon. Now, the C2HCl, okay, hydrogen can only form one bond. Chlorine really only wants to have one bond. Okay, so much like some of the previous ones, you're going to connect both of the carbons together and put the hydrogen and chlorine on the outside. Okay, so that does it for our molecular models lab. So the bulk of it is simply come up with the valence, draw a, again, this electron dot diagram means that we want a Lewis drawing. Okay, so do a Lewis structure. The ball and stick, we want to actually show the marbles, right, and designate which marble is which. Do your best to try and fit your drawing in the box there. And then decide whether something is polar or nonpolar. And like I said, a non-symmetrical molecule will likely be polar. Okay, you can also consult an electronegativity chart if you think that will help. Okay, but generally you can tell from the shape of the molecule whether it is going to be polar or not, based on whether it is perfectly symmetrical or asymmetrical. Okay, so have fun. Don't forget to turn in all parts of this lab, the pre-lab, this main data section, and post-lab. There's also a quiz on Canvas because this is technically a lab.